All right. Hello, everyone. I hope this is clearly audible to anybody watching. I am David. I am a European and international law student, and I've also been doing debate in some capacity, either high school or university, for about 6 years now. And today I'm going to be giving a brief workshop on United Nations peacekeeping for the Dutch competitive platform. I want to make two disclaimers or clarifications before I start the workshop. Firstly, I'm not an expert on the United Nations, on peacekeeping, on international law, international relations, or any of the subjects in the video. I have studied parts of the things that are going to be mentioned in some of my courses, and I have general knowledge on the topic, and I've also done specific research for the presentation, but do take the things that I say with a grain of salt. Obviously, do your own research. If you know things yourself, keep that in mind even after watching this workshop. This is meant to be an introductory workshop on peacekeeping and its relevance for some debating motions, not an authoritative statement on any of the missions, on their successes, failures, on any downsides or upsides of the UNPK. You're free to draw your own conclusions, and there are also far smarter people than myself that have drawn conclusions and have written academic literature on the subject that I've consulted, but you should also obviously consult yourself if this is something that you're deeply interested in. Secondly, this is not going to be a workshop on any one particular UNPK mission. So while I will make references to UNPK missions, I'm not going to go into a lot of depth on what those missions are, mostly because this is just going to take significantly too much time. And the purpose of this workshop is more so to give an introductory understanding of UNPK as a whole, its relevance for some debating motions, as well as the general developments, upsides, and downsides, rather than any one particular or a couple of particular missions. This would require far too much context on the conflict, on the historical background, on the mandate of the mission specifically. And this is also just publicly available information if you're really interested into it. So you can go in the UNPK website and they have all of their active missions and the mandates for those missions where you can just read more about the specific thing. You can also, and probably should, learn about the dynamics of the conflicts themselves. So this is not something the presentation is going to cover. What the presentation is going to cover is, firstly, some general context on UN peacekeeping, the legal basis in international law for it, the way that it operates, the things that it does and the times when it does them, the historical developments in the UNPK, because these are useful for understanding the way that it operates now, but also the way that it operated previously and potentially the reason why opinions about it are the way they are in certain countries. And then finally, modern developments on the UNPK. What are the things that are happening right now? What are the things that are changing before going into some motions that either directly or indirectly concern United Nations peacekeeping and discussing some of the possible arguments and relevances of these motions. So starting on a very, very basic note, I'm just going to talk about what the UNPK is. The UNPK is based under the United Nations, as suggested by the name quite obviously, and it is under the mandate of the United Nations Security Council. So every single mission has a mandate, and the mandate to the mission is given by the United Nations Security Council. And there's three chapters that can be involved to start up or give a mandate for a UNPK mission to operate. Firstly, it's chapter number 6 on the peaceful resolution of disputes, chapter number 7 on collective peace and security, and chapter number 8 on regional arrangements for peace and security. It's fairly self-explanatory why any one of these chapters could be a legal basis for establishment of a UNPK mandate. And if it's not, it will be self-explanatory when I get into what they concretely do later on. But I mean, I think it's quite intuitive that it's things like resolution of disputes between countries, it's things like collective security, and or regional arrangements where there is cooperation with regional nations and regional blocs. Now, it's important to note that there is a general prohibition on the use of force in international law, both in the UN Charter and under customary international law by extension. So the only way that the UNPK could really operate, because in certain instances there is force used by the peacekeepers themselves, is under a mandate of the United Nations Security Council. And this is also why most commonly, and I think every single mission has been actually authorized under Chapter 7, because this is the chapter under which the United Nations Security Council is permitted to authorize forcible measures, including but not limited to the use of force in certain instances, but also things like sanctions, etc. So this is the most common legal basis that is used for starting up and giving mandates to UNPK missions. The way that UNPK missions work after the establishment of the UN security mandate is that they're handed over to a separate agency of the United Nations Peacekeeping Office, which details the mandate and creates the precise instructions for how the mission is going to operate. To put it simply, the mandate is just a set of instructions missions for a particular mission. So what it does is it outlines the goals of the mission, what the mission is going to do, how many people are going to be deployed, what are going to be the tasks of the people that are deployed, how many years is the mission going to be active for, and when is the mission going to withdraw? So when are the objectives completed and the United Nations peacekeepers are able to leave a particular nation? The mandate takes into account the specificities of the conflict, and mandates vary in nature from being very, very narrow in focus to very, very broad. I'm going to talk about the historical development around the types of mandates in a couple of slides. The way that countries contribute and the way that UNPK missions are comprised is on voluntary participation from member states of the UN, which is basically every single country in the world. Now, it's important to flag that while there is an obligation for countries under the UN Charter to support the United Nations Security Council in the actions that it takes, there is no concrete obligation on countries to participate in UNPK missions because they're based on voluntary contribution from member states. The way the contributions de facto play out is that the majority of logistical contributions, so things like funding, technical personnel, technical assistance, intelligence, etc., comes from typically what we would consider developed countries. I think the top three are the US, Germany, and Japan. I might be mixing up the order, but it's these sort of Western developed economically countries. The majority of the troops are supplied from less developed nations. I think the top contributor is Nepal. The Congo is, I think, up there. Rwanda might be quite high, if I'm not mistaken. But it's primarily countries that are less economically developed, by some considered the global south. The reason for this is quite simple. Firstly, because these nations are just the most proximate to the areas in which a lot of the UNPK missions currently happen. So it's reasonable for them to be contributing troops because it's logistically easier, and these sort of things are taken into account based on where the mission is happening. It also might just be things like knowing the terrain or speaking the language. But secondly, it's just because richer countries tend to not want to militarily contribute, but they're able to contribute in logistical ways. So that's kind of how they get out of their, mandatory participation, or they just have different forms of voluntary participation. There's no strict legal obligation per se that tells the country, you must contribute X amount of soldiers or X amount of logistics, though. I'm going to touch on why this might be an issue in the future in a couple of slides towards the end of the presentation. The UNPK missions are generally guided with a lot of caveats. I wanted to say a few, but a lot of caveats by three basic principles. I'm going to explain the caveats later on. Firstly, it's consent of the parties. So you don't deploy a UNPK mission as a collective security operation, as some might traditionally imagine under Chapter 7 of the Charter, which would be forcible against the nation. So sanctions, for example, under Chapter 7, would be imposed against the consent of the nation against which they were imposed. That's intuitive to how sanctions generally work. UNPK missions are imposed only with the consent of the parties to the conflict. So they're usually implemented as a part of a ceasefire or peace agreement, where the UNPK missions are traditionally only there to oversee the implementation of the peace agreement rather than do anything else. Secondly, it's impartiality and neutrality, where the mission is not there to act on behalf of any national government, nor is it there to take any particular side in the conflict, but to help the countries transition from a time of war to a time of peace. This is also the officially stated goal of the United Nations peacekeeping. Like, this is one of the first things you're going to read if you open up their website. It's going to be, about the perilous transition from war to peace times, worded very, very nicely. The third principle is non-use of force, except in self-defense or defense of the mandate. This is where most developments happened historically, and I'm going to talk about that later. But the TLDR, for the purposes of this particular moment in the presentation, is just peacekeepers are not on an operational level allowed to use force. So mandates do not tell them to go in there and, kill the bad guys. They're just there to oversee peaceful processes and transitions to peacetime, but they are able to use force in self-defense, so if they are attacked, or in defense of the mandate, which is more broad, and I'm going to touch on that slightly later on. But these are the three basic principles that were developed in the so-called golden era of UN peacekeeping. It's the three golden principles. There are currently 11 active UNPK operations. I can name a few. I think one of the oldest is Golan Heights in Syria. They're also present in Kosovo. I think they either recently withdrew or currently withdrawing from the Democratic Republic of Congo. They're present in the Central African Republic. So there's a lot of active missions. You can find them all on the UN website. As I flagged previously, this is not a goal of this presentation to in-depth explain any one of the missions that are happening. So what does the UNPK do beyond, a brief introduction of their principles and the way that the missions are typically set up? There's three concepts that are relevant to the UNPK, all of which sound very, very similar. It's peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peace building. The difference between these might be confusing. So I have a model down at the bottom of the screen that somewhat hopefully illustrates what these concepts mean. It is a model of the different stages of conflict breaking out. And we're just going to look at the part after war, right? So right there in the middle, this is the peak of the conflict. This is when there's active fighting going on. This is when there's no agreement between the sides. Usually very little negotiations between the two sides either. At this point, United Nations peacekeeping has very, very little to do because the only thing that can be done is limiting the extent of the war. However, soon after that, when things like ceasefire agreements begin to be signed or negotiated, we enter the first stage, which is peacekeeping. This is, in the most traditional sense, just preventing people from dying. This might be things like establishing safe zones for civilians and making sure that the civilians aren't killed in the safe zones that you have established. This might just mean things like having troops on the ground in cities to ensure that the ceasefire agreement is, put through properly and that no one side spoils the negotiations of the peace agreement. Once the peace or once the ceasefire has been signed, I use the term interchangeably here. That's wrong. A ceasefire is different to a peace agreement because it's just a cessation of hostilities agreement. That usually comes before the signing of peace agreements. In the stage of signing a peace agreement, and in the stage of negotiating a peace agreement, peacemaking is more relevant. This is things like negotiations between the two parties that seek to create conditions for lasting peace. So it involves less, troops on the ground prevent people from getting killed, and more negotiation processes, ensuring that there's common grounds that the parties are able to find, planning out transitions to typically, because peacekeeping is very much associated, UN peacekeeping is very much associated with the liberal world order, planning out a transition to democracy, planning out elections, planning out power sharing agreements between the parties, etc., etc. Thirdly, and this is after both a ceasefire and a peace agreement, we enter normalization and reconciliation stages. This is where we address the causes of the conflict rather than the symptoms of the conflict. So we're no longer addressing the fighting. Hopefully, this is stopped with the signing of a peace agreement. But we're addressing things like inequality. We're addressing things like ethnic or religious tensions between the people. These fall into things like structural peace building, where we address these structural causes like inequality and oppression of minorities that might have led to conflict breaking out. The final stage is cultural peace building, where we address the differences in opinion between the people and we seek to reintegrate people into society. I want to flag that the concepts I just explained are not concepts that are unique or even directly related to United Nations peacekeeping. These are just concepts of understanding the stages of post-war reconciliation, reconstruction, and just transition from war to peacetime. Once we've completed these steps, we've created lasting peace. We can complete, and most of the time, we only complete some of these steps, and usually not in full either, because these are very long and complicated processes. Now, the intuitive thing would be to assume that United Nations peacekeeping is only involved in the peacekeeping stage of the chart, because that's in the name. Ironically, this would be wrong. And not only are they not only involved in peacekeeping, traditionally, they're not the ones that are supposed to be necessarily doing peacekeeping in its traditional sense that might be understood under this model. So they weren't there to physically guard civilians and take any one side in the conflict and prevent the other guys from killing each other. They were usually deployed post the signing of at least a ceasefire agreement, but usually a peace agreement, and were there to oversee implementation processes. However, with recent developments and historical developments, missions became more multidimensional and multifaceted. What this means is that now, and also technically in the past, but even more so currently, United Nations peacekeeping is involved in all of the various stages that I've just described, and you can see it in Figure 2. UNPK activities touch on things that happen while the conflict is ongoing. When the conflict is ending, this is when they do things like peacemaking and peace enforcement. In this context, peace enforcement would correspond to peacekeeping in the previous chart. After the signing of a ceasefire agreement, they continue to do peacekeeping, so preventing civilians, overseeing the ceasefire agreement. This is, the traditional form of peacekeeping as per the UNPK. And they also oftentimes engage in things like post-conflict peace building and reconstruction. This might involve things like setting up democratic institutions and governments, overseeing local elections, which is a very, very common practice that they do. But it might also mean things that are more local and might be more related to things like cultural peace building. It's things like demobilization and reintegration programs that are very, very common in areas that had high rates of child soldiers being used in the war. So it's just necessary to have, disarmament programs, getting people back into communities, getting communities to be functional again, getting weapons out of the communities so people can live in peace. These are all activities that United Nations peacekeepers are currently expected to do, depending on the specific mandate. So there's different mandates that mandate them to do different things, as I explained before. Depending on what your mandate is, this might be take one form or another. And this relates to the distinction between traditional, multidimensional, and robust missions. I'm going to cover the historical development of these, but when I use any one of these terms, traditional missions are those that stick by the golden trinity of principles. These are missions that are usually there only after the ceasefire and only for the sake of oversight. They usually have very, very limited involvement in the conflict, very, very limited involvement with any of the actors, and are simply there to oversee the ceasefire process that's already been negotiated, oftentimes with the help of the United Nations and their representatives, but the peacekeepers are there to just oversee the things that are already agreed upon, just stand in the territorially defined lines that are signed in the peace agreement or the ceasefire agreement. Multidimensional missions are missions that are encompassing a lot more of the things that I talked about just a second ago. So they're missions that involve themselves both with peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peace building at the same time or at different stages of the conflict. And these are not things that follow a strict hierarchical timeline, right? You can do peace building even though technically you've not completed the peacemaking and peacekeeping stages, which is why multidimensional missions are A, multidimensional, but B, incredibly, incredibly complicated. Finally, there's robust missions. And robust missions are a relatively recent development from around 2000s, 2001, and then more frequently 2013, 2010s, which are missions that have a greater amount of force that is used in the mission. So they're missions that are more focused on peace enforcement and peacemaking than they are on reconstruction, peacekeeping, and peace building, although they might have these things come in later stages. But because these missions are usually deployed during active conflict, their mandates allow for a greater use of force. I'm going to talk about what this precisely means and the historical developments that happened for this to emerge in a second. Evolution of the UNPK. This is really important to understand the way that UNPK missions work and also just the reasons for why UNPK missions are the way that they are. The UNPK was established in 1948, and this is the first generation of the UNPK. It was established to primarily just oversee tensions between the US and the USSR in the Middle East, especially relating to the Suez Canal. The funny thing about this is there are very, very few UN missions from the first generation. The reason for this is very, very simple. They need to be authorized by the UN Security Council. At the time, the US and the USSR vetoed each other's UN Security Council proposals purely out of principle. So it was very, very difficult to set up a UNPK mandate because at any given point, the US or the USSR would just veto the setting up of the UNPK and deployment of peacekeepers into any particular conflict. There were a couple of missions that are set up. I think the Golden Heights mission that I mentioned previously in Syria is one of the missions that is the oldest, and it is a first generation UNPK mission. In this time, there's very strict abiding by the three golden principles, and there's also just very few missions due to the political tensions. Now, in 1990 and onwards, the Cold War ends, and the US becomes a stronger power on the global stage and a stronger player on the global stage. We enter the second generation of peacekeeping, where while there is abiding by the traditional principles, there's substantially more missions that are being authorized. This is also where most people would have probably heard of UNPK from, because it's two of the most famous, or badly famous missions in the history of the UNPK, which is the mission to former Yugoslavia, specifically Bosnia, and the mission to Rwanda during both the Rwandan and the Bosnian genocides. Famously, the UNPK failed to prevent either one of these atrocities, and this is the main thing that caused the transition from the second to the third generation in late 1990s to early 2000s. there's a general perception of the international community that the UNPK, and it's true, that the UNPK failed to prevent horrendous atrocities in Rwanda and in Bosnia. In fact, and if you're more interested about this, as I said, I'm not going to go into detail, but you can and probably should read up on their court cases in international law against United Nations peacekeepers. I know for a fact that there is a case against Dutch peacekeepers in Bosnia that stood by while ethnically Serb troops massacred Bosniaks in multiple villages, I think, including Srebrenica, which is the most famous genocide of the Bosnian War. It's very, very, sad and difficult to read and to learn about, but it's one of the biggest failures of the UNPK alongside Rwanda to prevent the atrocities and prevent two separate genocides. In response to this, the international community and the UN decided that something needs to change, and there's two most relevant developments, 1 year apart. The first is the Brahimi report in the year 2000, which is a report by the United Nations, which basically seeks to expand the mandate of the UNPK. It expands the individual mandates to include greater amounts of the use of force and allow peacekeepers to intervene in instances where civilians are being harmed. So this is the first development, or the first point at which so-called robust missions are a widespread development in regards to the UNPK. There was a couple of missions that used force in the late 1990s that were very, very unsuccessful as well. But the general start and adoption of robust missions and robust mandates is with the Brahimi report in the year 2000. These missions allow the use of force on a tactical level in defense of the mandate. This is an important distinction from the previous principle, which is in self-defense. The use of force in self-defense means that if you as a peacekeeper are attacked, you're allowed to shoot back. This is quite intuitive and there's nothing crazy about that. Use of force in defense of the mandate, as I mentioned previously, doesn't allow the operation itself to be one that is forceful, but it does allow the use of force if you are defending the goals that are set out in the mandate. So if one of the goals is things like protection of civilians, you're allowed to use force to protect the mandate that you are given. It is a ridiculously broad amount of things that this can encompass, and post these developments, there are UNPK missions that have carried out things like artillery strikes on positions of, enemy, so to say, forces, because they're technically impartial. They've carried out armed attacks and counterinsurgency operations alongside national troops. They've acted a lot more like a military force than they have a peacemaking force and a peacekeeping force because of the development that allows them to use force in defense of the mandate. The second relevant development around this time in 2001 happens not because of the United Nations per se, but it's the development of the responsibility to protect doctrine in international law. I'm not going to go into detail on the doctrine, but the TLDR is very, very similar to the self-defense, defense of the mandate logic. It is a responsibility on the international community to intervene in instances in which countries are unable to protect their own people against atrocities, even against the consent of these nations. This is the doctrine under which US and NATO interventions in the Yugoslav wars and later on into Kosovo with the bombing of Belgrade were justified. I'm not going to go into judgments on these or discussions on these, but it's important to know that R2P doctrine is developed around this time, which increases the amount of robust missions that you get from the side of UNPK as well, because there's general normalization of, forceful interventions and missions for the sake of humanitarian protection around this time. There's another year that I put here, which is 2013. Again, not going into detail, but do read up on this if you're interested. This is the start of the Force Intervention Brigade in the Democratic Republic of Congo against the M23 guerrillas. This is a UNPK operation that explicitly is a counterinsurgency operation at the same time, cooperates with national authorities to fight against the M23 guerrilla movement in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It is really, really interesting because I think it's very unique in its nature because it is a literal anti-terrorist counterinsurgency mission by the UNPK that is different even from robust missions previously, in that it is far more interventionist and just a greater amount of military force is used, and its goals are explicitly ones that are military and cooperate with the national authority and take one of the sides in the conflict. probably the correct side. But in any case, it is a departure very clearly from second and first generation principles of the UNPK. Finally, we have the fourth generation of the UNPK, which is what we have currently, which isn't much different. The main difference is that and I'm going to talk about this in recent developments, there's more targeted mandates. So we've kind of gone away from the whole peace enforcement thing to the same extent, mostly just because there's growing skepticism of the UNPK. I'll talk about this in a second, and because logistically these missions are very difficult because they have a lot of objectives. They're multidimensional. And it's very difficult to ensure that these missions are successful. So there's a slight scaling down of missions and an increase in regional cooperation. Also because there's just more regional organizations that exist. Like we have the African Union that currently exists and that plays a part. We have a growing influence of BRICS countries that advocate for a stepping away from the US hegemonic world order. So there's just a general shift in this, which is why there's more regional cooperation and there's smaller and more scaled down missions. This is just the main distinction. Some scholars talk about a fifth future generation, which would be an increase from what is currently happening with multifaceted cooperative missions with regional authorities into a world in which peacekeeping is even smaller, more localized, but at the same time more cooperative with national bodies rather than a top-down system of the UN. Greater cooperation from actors such as China that are getting relevance on the global stage. But a lot of this currently is, from what I've seen, quite speculative. So there's mentions of a fifth generation. Some people technically don't even mention a fourth generation, claim we're still in a third generation. There's divided opinions on this, but these are the broad generations and the evolution of the UNPK. As you can see, the UNPK in the third, the fourth, the fifth generations looks radically different from the starting principles that I talked about just a couple of slides ago. So I really felt the need to explain the evolution of it. Funnily enough, if you go on the UNPK website, you still find the three basic principles as what all UNPK missions are based on. But it is important to note that de facto, there's a lot of departure in local aspect, like in particular missions and particular aspects from the principles, even though the principles are still applicable and are still a thing that UN missions should, in theory, abide by. Just a quick discussion on the strengths and weaknesses of the UNPK then. There's a number of strengths of the UNPK, and I want to start with this because the UNPK is oftentimes very, very criticized, both in academic literature and in common discussions, for good reasons of ineffectiveness and oftentimes abuses by UN troops. Touching on that in a second. The UNPK has been shown to reduce violence and effectively establish safe zones. The extent to which they're able to establish safe zones, especially historically, is up to legitimate question because there was instances in which human rights abuses and things like genocide and war crimes were committed within UN designated safe zones as well. The important thing, though, is that on average, when UNPK troops are present in an area, the amount of violence in that area statistically is shown to decrease by a meaningful percentage as opposed to an absence of UN troops. I don't remember the number. I don't think any of the papers that I've read mention a particular number, but there is ample evidence that there is a reduction in the amount of violence that is committed. Secondly, there's increased legitimacy of the peace process in general and of the reconstruction process. So oftentimes, even when UNPK troops don't do things like establish safe zones, and when they don't physically, corridor off civilian areas to prevent human rights abuses, they're able to increase legitimacy of a given peace process and therefore ensure things like election oversight runs more smoothly, to ensure things like countries being willing to cooperate in negotiations and an absence of spoilers. So countries that are uncooperative and are unwilling to cooperate, it increases the trust that people oftentimes feel in their governments and in their safety. The presence of the blue helmets to a lot of people, potentially less so with the recent backlash, but to a significant amount of people still, is a signatory that they are safe. It is a sign that the conflict is ending, and it is a sign that peace processes are continuing and happening. And this is sometimes very reassuring, and it increases the legitimacy of the process in general. Finally, they're able to contribute in things like demobilization programs, things like de-armament programs and reintegration programs that I've mentioned previously, especially when we talk about peace building. And here, they're often very effective. They're effective at reintegrating people into societies. They have large amounts of local cooperation as well. And they're able to do things not only like nation building and election oversight, but also like local actions and community reintegration in cooperation with national authorities and national bodies, which improves on things like context-specific situations, which is one of the criticisms of the UN, that it doesn't account for local traditions and contexts and cultures. A lot of the time, this is something that the UN is able to take into account might not do so to the greatest extent, but this is something that happens in certain instances. If you want to read more on the successes of the UN, I think Cambodia with the Khmer Rouge is definitely one of the successes of the UN, or regarded as such. Côte d'Ivoire is also one of the instances in which they were able to set up effective elections. I think Liberia is also listed as one of the traditionally considered successes of the UN. It's important to flag that a lot of the missions just can't be ruled as a success or failure, and it is important to just look at the benefits and the downsides of the missions. There's a lot of instances where there's massive controversy, but after the UN left, there's still, more effective elections that were set up. It is a question of would this have happened without them? How many people would have been harmed? How many people would have been harmed? It's a difficult question to answer, but there are recorded UN successes. There are indications that there's benefits to the UNPK existing and being present in conflict areas. On the more commonly discussed subject of the UNPK, the weaknesses of the UNPK. There are many weaknesses of the UNPK that people like to mention. It is things like failure to prevent atrocities, most notably the two that I've mentioned, so Bosnia, Rwanda, Srebrenica, and Rwandan genocide, but also in many other instances where the UNPK just doesn't have the physical capacity to intervene to a sufficient extent to protect civilians. This is due to, in part, failures on behalf of the UNPK and the way that mandates are set up, but in part just logistical reasons. It's very difficult to protect civilians in a conflict area. Conflict areas are oftentimes very uncertain. You can't corridor off every single city that exists and prevent fighting from reaching civilian areas at any point. Some of these are very obviously the fault of the UNPK and the way that mandates were set up, such as when troops were looking by as Srebrenica genocide happened. Some of these are just logistical failures that are attributed to the UNPK because they're promising to protect people, but due to reasonable reasons, unable to deliver on the promises. And obviously, this is something that people see as a massive failure of the UNPK. It's a really bad feeling if you perceive yourself to be safe, and then horrible atrocities happen to your people, even though the UNPK is present in the area. Secondly, there's unintended consequences of robust peacekeeping. And this is particularly in regards to the historical development of peacekeeping, as opposed to peacekeeping in general, theoretically. Robust peacekeeping is a very controversial topic in academic discussions and just general discussions surrounding the UNPK for two main reasons. The first is just a departure from the traditional principles that I'm going to talk about in a second. But also it is because there's a lot of unintended consequences of robust peacekeeping, like putting the peacekeepers themselves in greater danger. Obviously, if you're involved in hostilities, you're also allowed to be shot at in part of the hostilities themselves. This is one of the rules of international humanitarian law. If you're a humanitarian worker, you cannot be targeted. But if you're a participant in combat, you can be targeted. So this often is detrimental to the missions themselves because they're allowed to be targeted in combat at the point at which they engage in combat, such as the Forced Intervention Brigade, and the point at which they take part in hostilities. But secondly, this oftentimes prevents the delivery of humanitarian aid and the objectives of the missions themselves. So if you're allowed to be targeted in hostilities, it is harder for you to access areas with things like food aid or participate in reconciliation programs because you're taking a side, or if not directly taking a side, you're fighting within the conflict, which changes the way that people perceive you. You get less legitimacy, but you're also just less physically able to do things because you're now fair game, so to say, in the context, in the conduct of hostilities. Secondly, oftentimes robust peacekeeping is seen to destabilize nations rather than stabilize them. This is a very common critique of responsibility to protect doctrine and just collective security in international law in general, that interventions forcibly oftentimes just cause negotiation processes to fall apart. They might force people to hate each other more. They might force actors to dislike the UN as a concept or perceive it to be Western influence and choose to opt out of negotiation processes. There's a lot of things that are discussed, and this is one of the potential unintended consequences of robust peacekeeping that you can talk about. Finally, there's multiple recorded instances of abuses in various forms, primarily taking the form of sexual assault and sexual violence committed by UN troops. It's important to flag UN troops are volunteers, and they're also oftentimes volunteers that operate under caveats set up by their national militaries, and they're taken from national militaries and national military forces. These are people that oftentimes just aren't good people in the slightest, and the UN has limited capacity to filter these people out prior to abuses happening. And this is a logistically difficult process. There's improvements that the UN attempts to make on this. I'll cover current relevant developments in a second. But there's multiple recorded instances. You can read off and read about some of these. Haiti is, I think, one of the most disturbing ones because it involves human trafficking rings, but also multiple others in which you have individual and structural abuses of people by UN troops. These are reasons why the UNPK is oftentimes criticized, preferred to not be involved in conflict, due to the way that it's set up that makes these sort of things, I don't want to say inevitable, but far more frequent than they ideally should be in these circumstances. I want to talk a bit about the challenges faced by the UNPK as well, because considering there are good things to the UNPK, it faces a number of challenges beyond the ones that I've already mentioned that are more so weaknesses of it in regards to why it's ineffective. There's 5 challenges that a lot of academic literature on the subject identifies that mostly come with the transition from traditional peacekeeping missions to multifaceted and robust missions, both separately and at the same time. The first is that multifaceted missions specifically set out a lot of expectations. The UN comes in, it's a massive international organization. It will protect you, you will get peace. Oftentimes, this is not a viable reality of the conflict. Oftentimes, this might or might not be in the hands of the UN peacekeepers, but meeting expectations and meeting the mandates, but also the expectations that people have for the UN is incredibly difficult. This is also why, and this is the image that you can see, these are a very violent, I think 2022 anti-UNPK protests in the Democratic Republic of the Congo against MONUSCO, the mission of the UNPK to there. And they happened because civilians felt like the UNPK was ineffective and unable to protect the civilians in the area, which is a reasonable thing for people to think, but it's a massive challenge by the UNPK to maintain the legitimacy that they've built up through their successful missions in missions that might not reach the standard of success, or even just the standard of success that people might expect very reasonably, because obviously violence is a very horrifying and traumatizing thing on people. Meeting this expectation only partially often just doesn't suffice for the people to feel any sort of content. The second challenge is the principles of peacekeeping themselves. As you could see throughout the presentation, even without me explicitly saying it, the UN strays away from these principles in a million different ways. Not only through the use of force caveat thing, but also through things like neutrality and impartiality, right? If you, especially now when you intervene with robust missions on behalf of particular governments that you consider to be legitimate against the rebel forces, there inevitably raises a question. There is a question raised whether you are neutral. Actually, the answer is you're not. You can be impartial, so you can judge both sides and prevent human rights abuses by both sides, but you're not neutral, which causes difficulties that I've mentioned previously for being able to enter countries in the first place, because you do still need the consent of the countries. This is one of the principles that is quite strictly abided by. So it's very, very difficult to guarantee this consent and very, very difficult to just have missions in the first place and reap the benefits of them. Thirdly, it's the vulnerability of peacekeepers. I talked about this before. If you're involved in hostilities, you're vulnerable and you're under risk of armed attack, especially if you actively militarily involve yourself in this. Finally, it's a capacity and other agencies of the UN. These are quite closely interrelated with the others, but other agencies of the UN are the stuff that I talked about previously in regards to supplying of humanitarian aid, but not just by the operation itself, right? Anti-UNPK sentiment oftentimes spills over to anti-UN and anti-Western sentiment. So other agencies of the UN, agencies that have nothing to do with the UNPK, are only focused on things like humanitarian relief. I don't know, the UNRWA, right? That is one of the most recent relevant examples. It is something that inadvertently gets caught in the crossfire of failures and successes of the UNPK. The thoughts that people have on the UNPK and its involvement, its neutrality, its participation in hostilities, etc., that affect the way that other UN agencies might be able to function in conflict environments, supply aid, help with reconstruction, help with unrelated things like medical developments, etc. Finally, its capacity. Because the UN is a voluntary, UNPK is based on voluntary contributions, and there's no concrete requirement on nations. It's far more difficult to generate forces when there's far more losses and just far more expected harms to the soldiers that go. So less nations are willing to send their own militaries. But also, if you have broader missions, you need to do more things. So you need to mobilize more soldiers and more resources, which is once again something that a lot of countries just don't want to do. They have their own militaries, they have their own priorities. They often just don't care enough to supply the people to the end. This is why a lot of the time missions are ineffective. This might help you understand why certain missions failed, but this might also help you understand, what can be improved in regards to this. Final slide before motions. This is taking far longer than I thought it would, but hopefully you might watch this partly, get some stuff out of it. You can also skip parts if you want. Modern developments. There's a couple of things that are happening in the 4th, 5th generation of peacekeeping that I think are relevant to just mention and keep in mind. Firstly, as I said previously, there's downsizing and there's more targeted missions. The very simple reason for this is the financial and logistical constraints that I mentioned previously. So instead of very broad missions become more targeted. They focus on one part of the conflict. So in a way, we're kind of going back to what we had in the 1st generation, which had missions that only oversee ceasefires, except we do no longer only oversee ceasefires. They're just more targeted in what they do. So you might have a mission that only takes care of things like dearmament and remobilization, only a mission that's there to oversee elections, a mission that's only there to secure civilians from the act of fighting, things like the Force Intervention Brigade that's a very narrow mandate to fight the M23 and doesn't concern itself with things like reconstruction, etc. And the missions are also smaller, so we have less troops, we have a smaller mandate, but the mandate is more targeted. In some ways, this might be better. In some ways, this might be worse, but this is a relevant development to consider. In part, this happens because of funding issues. Very famously, Donald Trump, cutting funding from UN agencies, including the UNPK, but also a lot of other nations have other things to be worried about or things that they perceive to be more important, and just cut down on the amount of support, especially Western nations that are increasingly becoming isolationist, that cut down on the amount of support they're willing to give to the UNPK, which limits its capacity and causes point number one to happen. There's more cooperation with regional bodies. This is A, out of the previous two factors than out of necessity, but B, because it's oftentimes just a more effective strategy to cooperate with bodies that have more legitimacy within the regional context. This is a way to also kind of separate yourself from the past failures and accusations of the UNPK and the UN as a colonial entity. This might help gain legitimacy if you're cooperating with actors like the African Union or China in the context of its BRI projects. You don't actually cooperate with the BRI, but because China has global influence that's increasing along the global south, you might want to cooperate more extensively with these actors. There's also the Action for Peacekeeping project. I think it's established 2018. That had a couple of objectives for improvements. I'll just list two that I think are, not self-intuitive and quite relevant to the things that I've discussed. It's gender balance. So there's an increased attention to things like equality within the UNPK operations themselves, the involvement of women in these processes. And oftentimes this isn't just, a symbolic gesture. This is very, very relevant because demobilization and reintegration processes can be very, very different for, let's say, women in general, but specifically, let's say, female child soldiers as opposed to male child soldiers, because the context of their communities and the stigma that they might face and the trauma that they might face is very distinct in the things that they've experienced and the way that they interact with people, that a lot of the time this genuinely just does mean that you're going to have better missions that are more capable of addressing the unique struggles that people face on the ground. Secondly, it's improving conduct by peacekeepers. I've mentioned previously the multiple abuses. There are things that can be done about this. A country's troops can be forbidden from participating in UNPK missions in a given area, considering that there had a disproportionately high number of abuses committed by the troops of this military. And just general conduct of peacekeepers is something that the UN acknowledges as an issue and tries to resolve. Although it's, for reasons I said before, a very difficult thing to resolve. And the Action for Peacekeeping plan, I don't think it has any tangible things that are done to resolve this. Cool. Final thing, and then you don't have to watch me ramble about this anymore, is motions. There's three categories of motions that I could find about the UNPK in general. I'm not going to go over every single motion in detail because I hope the things that I've discussed give you enough spec-ish to understand how to debate the motions and the general logic to figure out the arguments. And also some of the things I said before, like the challenges faced by the UNPK, are just, in a particular context, arguments for a certain motion. The first type is just UNPK good or bad. These are motions that just deal with, should the UNPK give mission XYZ with mandate XYZ exist? These can be general, like motion number one here, which is this House would prioritize cutting staff from specialized agencies rather than for peacekeeping or humanitarian branches, which is not exactly UNPK good or bad motion, but it's, which part of the UN is more important. I think this one's quite interesting. I also think the interrelation between the way that the UNPK affects the UN specialized agencies makes this motion, and the other way around, makes this motion a little bit strange. But it is a pretty interesting discussion to be had. Which one's more important, what the UNPK actually contributes, whether it's something that is perceived to be legitimate and therefore worthy to keep. Some of these might be more specific, like the Force Intervention Brigade that I mentioned quite frequently throughout this presentation. I considered doing a deep dive on it. Evidently, I didn't have the time. Good thing that I didn't do that. But do read up about it. Very, very interesting motion discussion to be had. And then general ones like UN protectorates, which would be under the administration of the UN, likely with high involvement of UN peacekeeping. Although I gotta say this is not exactly a peacekeeping good or bad motion, but has elements of that. And then reliance on international peacekeepers. This is also where the historical developments can help you. Rwanda, Yugoslavia. Yeah. The second type is what form the UNPK should take. And there's a great variety of motions here, but they basically just address the challenges and the harms that I talked about. So if you remember the five challenges and you remember the downsides that I've mentioned, uh, that's all this motion is. Any of these motions is just a discussion about any one of these harms, any one of these downsides, and arguments about the other downsides can be made as linkages. For example, the first motion of hiring private military contractors would probably concerns itself with national caveats by member states, funding contributions and funding issues, as well as abuses by soldiers, whether these would be more or less likely, things like enforcement, etc. And also just logistical caveats of this, like, would they be better at conducting organization, like the operations, or would they be worse? And you could include the military context of, if we do more military stuff, we might need more military people. PMCs are better at warfare than the people that we take that are there to supply food. So we might have more trained soldiers. We might protect more civilians. Pretty general arguments. I want to point out one of these motions, which is this has would allow the United Nations peacekeeping forces to invade and hold the said territory. I don't want to judge motions. I think this motion is very strange. I think this motion is very strange for a very simple reason of it violates most basic principles of the UNPK. It also has a bunch of logistical challenges that come with it, but it's a possible debate to be had, and I think it's a more extreme version of other debates to be had, which are just increased use of armed intervention or more robust or multifaceted as opposed to more traditional missions of the UN, which is, I think, a very good debate and a very good discussion to be had, despite the failures of traditional peacekeeping in Yugoslavia and Rwanda. I think it's a valid discussion to be had whether robust and multifaceted missions are a net good improvement to the way the UNPK functions. Finally, there's general IR motions, where you can make arguments related to the UNPK. This can be also soft motions that I didn't put here. Motions that talk about, post-conflict societies and reconstruction are motions in which you could mention the involvement of peacekeeping, or whether it could play a role in the development and the post-conflict reconstruction of this given hypothetical nation that you're discussing, or any example that you bring. But it could also be specific motions here, like Vietnam supporting the GSI, the Global Security Initiative. This is an initiative by China to have a separate global security system of regional alliances, which I guess would act complementary, but at the same time oppositionally to the UNPK, right? Because you kind of are not going to have both. So this is a question about whether you could present the UNPK as an alternative. You talk about why regional arrangements that the UNPK is doing are better. You could talk about why the UNPK from the side of the UN that's more top down is better. Just a lot of discussions here. I think it being specifically with Vietnam is something I don't have a lot of context on. I just found the motions from previous tournaments. I think hypothetically you could have a motion like this more generally, which is that you support regional arrangements as opposed to United Nations peacekeeping, or greater involvement of the African Union in UNPK missions, and the effect this would have on the missions themselves, as well as on the effectiveness of the missions and their legitimacy, reference to things I talked about in this workshop. The other thing is, the African Union pursuing sanctions against Rwanda over militarily engaging the M23. Here, the UNPK mission is very, very relevant, right? Because this is one of the, it's a very controversial mission. It's a very controversial mission in part of Rwandan accusations of it being not impartial, but actively taking a side and contributing to people who have done genocide. Not going into specifics, read up on it if you're interested. I highly recommend you to read up on it if you're interested. But motions like this, which discuss conflicts in which the UNPK is involved, are oftentimes areas in which arguments about the UNPK can be made, because the UNPK does do a lot. It participates in the hostilities. It keeps civilians safe. So arguments about the way this might affect the UNPK mission or the relationship with it might not be, debate breaking or winning arguments, but they might be things to consider if you're looking for things to talk about. This is it. I hope this wasn't too long. I hope you guys could learn something from this workshop about the way the UNPK works, what the UNPK is, what it does, and some motions more broadly. If people want to know more or just discuss specific things, you're free to research it on your own. There's the UNPK website, which has a list to the mandates, and mandates are publicly available information. Just open the mandate and read it. Very, very interesting if you care about the mission, but also backgrounds on the conflicts or things you can read. There's going to be discussion about the UNPK because it's a relevant thing. You can also contact me through any means that you want to contact me to discuss or ask questions about any of the things that I said, if any of the things are unclear, or if any of the things I said are wrong, in which case I will apologize and add a caveat to the video later on. Thank you for putting up with me, and have a nice day.